Let's begin with a short meditation. Okay. So in my experience, the two most important factors that, from a spiritual perspective, are contributing to what the earth and humanity is going through in our times are the notion of a collective or planetary initiation, the first initiation, and the specific karmic event of the planetary disaster that we've been also talking about. It's the combination of these two things that are, in my experience, the most determining factors in the nature of what's happening to the world, and the way that we're going through that, the way humanity, for instance, is going through the first initiation is very specifically and deeply affected by not only this ancient event in planetary history, but also all of the implications, the various long-term effects, the way that, for instance, we're experiencing being human now, and the kinds of imbalances that we experience in the human kingdom, and the way humanity relates to not only the nature kingdoms of the planet, but also other forms of life, especially other non-physical forms of life that all make up the planet. All of these things and many other things are very significantly impacted by the karmic history of the planet, the biggest focus of which is this planetary event in the distant past. Incidentally, based on some comments, questions that people had last week, and subsequent emails, I want to clarify that this was a very ancient event that I'm speaking about. In my own experience that I shared in the autobiography and talked a bit about last week, there wasn't a specific sense of time. It was something that I knew was very ancient, intuitively, in this state of consciousness that I was in when all of this unfolded within my being. But there was no dates. There was no, 10,000 years, 10 million years, hundreds of millions of years. There was no specific sense of time or even location. I knew that in some sense it was ancient, but there wasn't explicit in that experience a sense of the location. In the second phase of my experience, there was a very explicit sense that beings from that world were incarnating on the earth in a more current cycle. In other words, maybe not in the last few thousand years, but certainly within millions of years, which is a relatively small amount of time in planetary history. In the theosophical terminology, just to give a sense of context, the way some writers like Alice Bailey understand when this event happened can be understood in the context of a system of ideas and terminology that very briefly goes along the lines of that you have a planet as a whole that is its entire existence is its cycle of being, and within that cycle of being there's 7 major epochs that are very long, very huge cycles. In the theosophical terminology, these were called chains, and each chain is called a chain because it's made up of a series of globes, only one of which is dense physical. The other globes are subtle. So you have 7 globes, 3 descending, an incarnate dense physical globe, and then 3 ascending globes. And so that's a chain. Consciousness, life cycles through these chains in large, very, very, very large epochs. And there's 7 of these chains. So that's the basic sort of structure of the long-range evolution of a planet is life moving through 7 chains, and in each of those chains going through 7 globes. So globe is a 49th of the age of a planet. And then within a globe, there are rounds, and within rounds there are root races, and within root races there are sub-races. So when we talk of something like the occult lore of ancient times like Atlantis, these are relatively small cycles that last, say, thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, whereas a chain is a vastly longer period of time. And in this perspective, which, by the way, I'm not taking a strong position about the detailed accuracy of this understanding. This is a very complex system, and I think that's a whole nother question of like exactly is this the most precise way to understand how that's another question. I'm not going to take up that issue. I'm just saying that in the context of, say, Bailey's perspective, which she used those models, she felt that we were in the middle of the 4th chain. This is the same thing that's taught in the Secret Doctrine as well, and on the 4th globe of the 4th chain, and that this event took place in the previous chain, which is a very long time ago, so-called moon chain, which doesn't literally mean that it necessarily happened on the moon. It's just a symbolic term that's used to designate. So that's that perspective. I resonate with the general idea that it was ancient like that. Whatever system you might use to understand those cycles, whether you want to use yugas and manvantaras and so on, or this particular theosophical system and so on, that's another whole conversation. But also when Daskalos, who's our other perhaps primary source on this notion of a planetary event like this, he seemed to indicate that it was a long time ago also. And at one point, I did have a conversation with Daskalos back in the 80s, in the late 80s, about this, and had the same general impression that we didn't necessarily talk about chains per se, but a sense of it being very ancient like that. So this was, even though a very long time ago, this was such a significant event in the history of the Earth that it has had a very powerful impact on subsequent development. And there's a lot of intricacies to that, a lot of detail one could go into about the various aspects, some of which I've suggested somewhat about. So that's the planetary event aspect. A key element of, I think, what's challenging about the first initiation is kind of twofold. One is that it's in and of itself, passing through an initiation is challenging process. But to add to that, this ancient planetary karma really complicates it further. To begin with, a planetary, or let's look, for instance, at an individual initiation, a human being going through initiation. A key component of what's taking place is that our sense of identity being based in part significantly on identifying with a personality, and particularly with our physical bodies, is going through a big change at that time, during the first initiation. There is a variety, there are a variety of ways that we could look at what happens during initiations, but one could be a sense of identification. How do we experience ourselves? Who do we think we are? And the aspect of our nature as human beings where we have a feeling like we're separate individuals. A foundation for where that comes from is identification with our physical bodies. And that goes through a powerful shift during the first initiation. A lot of that shift can be a gradual kind of thing. There can be a sudden moment when there is a profound sense of a realization moment. That's not always the case. Frequently it's and to a large extent, either way, there's an aspect of the process that's gradual, a kind of growing intuition of a different, not only sense of identification, but a different sense of values. Because as our sense of identity shifts away from identifying with the physical body to a more spiritual sense of identity and spiritual values, it reorients our motivations. Our lifestyle goes through changes. Our relationships go through changes. So, in a very real sense, whether it's something that happens, takes place in a way where we go through a kind of crisis moment, like shamanic crisis of initiation, for instance, or if it's something that's more drawn out over months and years, even decades, sometimes, there is a death rebirth quality, dying to an old identity, and a rebirth of a new identity. And often, the more dramatic that crisis is, the more of an upheaval that attends it, and the more that there's a sense of kind of transition and confusion, like a movement from an old way to a new way, and disorientation and confusion. One of the versions of that we see collectively going on right now is that many people have over the last several centuries particularly lost interest in traditional forms of religion. That was a basic sense of our understanding of the universe and our understanding of who we are, our place in the world, and particularly our sense of values, our sense of morality, for instance, and a sense of where do we get a reason why we should be good people, for instance. What is the meaning of our lives? What happens after we leave incarnation? The way that a lot of that's been understood and conveyed in traditional religions is not appealing to a lot of modern people. Hundreds of millions of people are sort of gradually, and have been for centuries, migrating out of these traditions. But many of these people have not yet embraced a new, the rebirth hasn't happened. They haven't awakened to an alternative, a more mature form of spirituality. So in a sense, they're in a sort of state of suspension in between an old way and a new way. And this is one of the things I feel that's contributing to a degradation in values in various, populations in the world today, because people, they might be able to fall back on a kind of secular humanism, but for many people it's not as compelling, and there's still some sense of disorientation and confusion. But much of this, in my opinion, is transitional. It's because of a death rebirth. It's a falling away of the old and in making way for a rebirth. Part of the function of those who are on the spiritual path in modern times is to be a kind of continuity, to stand in the light of the Dharma and to sort of sustain a presence, a continuity that is serves as both a kind of glue to link the old and the new, to create continuity so that to minimize the degree to which there's a breakdown. It's interesting, this word tantra, especially like a keyword like transformation, that helps to bring out the soul of what, good part of what this tantric vision means. Tantra is a notion that instead of looking at, say, reality strictly as Maya or something that needs to simply be seen through or discarded or purified or let go of, personality or desires or karma, there's a sense of transformation suggests that in some way it's changing, yes, but at the same time, transformation implies that the soul, the essence of what it was, goes on. It just changes form. It is illuminated and healed, and a deeper reality of its nature is revealed in the process of transformation. And that's part of the function of modern initiates, is to provide that continuity, that there is an essence to the old, to human nature, to human culture, to what has been behind, the deeper spirit behind religious traditions, that's still true and alive and in the process of transformation globally. And to embody that, it helps to kind of it helps for the process to be less disruptive, less chaotic, less black and white, like a falling away, a sharp falling away, and then a space of chaos, and then a rebirth. There can be a bridge that's built as well. So part of the way that I'm experiencing, Karen and I are both experiencing a sense of participating in this, is to enter into this place of challenge that our humanity, our civilization, and our planet are experiencing today, and discover that point of continuity, that the heart of humanity and the earth that is in transformation and in healing, but isn't viewed from the point of view of something that's dying, but rather something that's being healed and transformed and renewed. And in fact, that becomes part of the key to a place of revelation too, because for me, there also is a way in which the Dharma itself is in transformation. Because although there is a heart of the Dharma, transcendental aspect of the Dharma that, in a sense, is eternal and unchanging, because It's beyond time. There's also an aspect of the Dharma that participates in time and takes different forms depending on the culture, even the individual, and certainly the time period. And in that sense, is like any aspect of culture, like the arts or science or literature, that politics, that over centuries and millennia goes through change. The Dharma goes through change as well and becomes essentially more enlightened over time, more rich and revealing and illuminating. That aspect of the Dharma points at and reveals the core. So even with a less than ideal version of the Dharma, you can still reach that core. It doesn't mean that the essence of enlightenment has changed, but in a very significant way, it does mean that the way we understand what that reality is and how we actualize that reality in the world can be significantly influenced by our understanding of what that essence is and how to relate to it, what its relationship to the rest of manifestation is. It's my view that there's a key way, that the very fact of planetary initiation isn't simply meaning, to include large numbers of people, for instance, the planet as a whole, even ultimately, in something, a way of being that's already been well established in a smaller percentage and simply needs to be adapted by the rest of the world. In one sense, it does mean that, but in another sense, it's also a birth moment for a new understanding of the Dharma. These are planetary initiations, a critical turning point in the very vision of what the Dharma means, because no matter how advanced a particular initiate in any given culture or time period may be, the way that they understand and approach and express their enlightenment is still in part conditioned by the time period and the culture and the tradition that they're part of, even their own personality and their karmic history. To heal the planetary disaster in some critical way, have a turning point moment in that healing, as well as to go through a collective initiation. My experience of the implication of that, which we're in the midst of now, so we're already able to see some of what the implications of that might be, will have a profound effect on the Dharma itself, the way that the Dharma is understood and expressed in our world. There's always been those, and one of the significances of understanding that there are not only is a deeper mystical aspect of all religions beyond the surface aspects, however enlightened those aspects may be. There's more and more people are coming to recognize a more profound inner reality to these to all spiritual traditions. But beyond that, there has always been a kind of cutting edge community, ultimately many of whom are not well known or known at all to the world. In the deepest aspects of the planet, it's been a sort of core community that not only expresses the continuity of a very ancient understanding and presence of the Dharma on our planet, but also embodies the cutting edge of exploring the transformation and deepening of the Dharma in our world. And so some of these different traditions that many of us are familiar with, particularly notably in the West, is the so-called Trans-Himalayan lineage and other manifestations of similar activities. I've mentioned, reference to a Chinese expression of this group and so on. One way of understanding these folks is that they represent a kind of cutting edge exploration of emergent Dharma in every generation. They're constantly not only realizing and embodying and confirming the ancient traditions, they're pushing the envelope, taking it deeper. But even still, even those deeper dimensions of our planetary spiritual lineage are going through transformation, and they're conditioned by the world situations, of the age, of the times that we're in. And so for them to participate in planetary initiation is very revelatory. It's a fundamental change of understanding. And these understandings are not also perfectly linear, you might say. Like, they're not just always an accumulation of little steps. Sometimes they're quantum leaps, like a fundamentally new perspective is realized that just rearranges everything. It's as if you're mountain climbing and you've got a quarter of the way up the mountain, and you look out, come to a clearing, and you look out at the valley below, and you have a certain understanding of the territory. You can see your little village below, and that's your sort of understanding. And if you've never climbed any higher than that, maybe everybody in your village has never climbed more than a third of the way up the mountain. So you just have this understanding that there's our village, there's mountains around us all, I'm on the biggest mountain in the region looking down into the valley, and this is my world. And then one day somebody decides to keep climbing higher, and they get much higher up the mountain, and then they come into a clearing, and suddenly they look out and they see that they can see past the hills that surround their valley, and they can see other valleys and other villages, and they realize for the first time that there's a much bigger community of humanity around them. It's isolated by these pockets in valleys, and only by climbing to, this much greater height could they see it, and it changes the story. It changes their understanding of reality, changes the context of their lives. There's a way in which this planetary initiation is providing a doorway through which not only the planet as a whole is reborn, but those that are the deepest explorers of the Dharma on our planet are allowed to, especially from the point of view of their physical bodies, but even in subtler dimensions as well. They are experiencing an initiation and rebirth into a basically new perspective. One that in the past has been able to be accessed in states of samadhi. But then when you come back down into your human personality and into this culture and this world, it has to kind of get refiltered back into the times, get integrated. That's part of what, say, bodhisattvahood means. Is it's the sacrifice of leaving that perfect nirvana of liberation from all conditioning factors and entering back into relativity, back into time, back into imperfection, back into a particular context, a world where people have a certain karma, they have a certain understanding, and you have to adapt to that. You have to take on and participate in that, to enter into the life and transformation of that world in order to be part of it, in order to love it and to serve it. You have to create a kind of hybrid personality, you might say, that's a mixture of your enlightenment and the state of the world. So the personalities, and even to some extent the spiritual realization nature, the soul of our planetary community of masters, has been kind of adjusted to a particular state of the planet, a particular archetype, for thousands of years. And this planetary initiation is allowing them to go through a rebirth where they can shift to the next archetype, shift to the next point of view, and embody that in the world. So what is that archetype? Well, when I've been using terms like the tantric vision, for instance. These are pieces of understanding what that is. This sense of this change coming has been going on for a while, of course. Certainly as far back as a couple of centuries. Perhaps a key expression of this process of planetary evolution happened with regard to Sri Aurobindo and the mother, who are one example of a number of people who have, in some ways, played a kind of archetypal role in participating in planetary initiation and planetary emergence and the revelation of a new vision. So let me take a moment to just talk about Aurobindo a little bit more and the mother. That's a long story. I'm sure some of you know some about that, but to sort of use that as a way of reflecting a perspective of what we're experiencing now. Aurobindo was more politically oriented when he was younger, in his 20s and even into his 30s. But at a certain point, partially from being in jail and having a lot of solitude, he started to go through a spiritual awakening. And some elements of his spiritual awakening were traditional in the sense that they had to do with experiencing things like accessing higher worlds and a sort of ascending model of climbing into deeper states, experiencing samadhi, experiencing cosmic consciousness, and so on. And this kind of culminated in a period of a certain level of self-realization. And something interesting began to happen after that. Aurobindo then began to experience a shift in his orientation, an intuitive shift towards not only a more embodied experience of unfoldment, but even a kind of exploration into incarnation and matter. He coined these phrases like he talked about the world having a subconscious and inconscient dimension, which were terms he used to describe layers of the kind of matter or consciousness dimensions of the earth that are less aware, that are less awakened. And he experienced the sense that he was, instead of climbing into sort of more heavenly dimensions, he was descending in a sense. At one point he wrote a poem in which he essentially said, I don't remember the exact words, but it was something along the lines of, I'm no longer involved in the process of opening to heaven, but instead I'm digging deep into the mire, into the darkness, into the heaviness of the world. And the more this was unfolding, the more he had this feeling that it was like a quest. His consciousness was driven by a process of seeking a revelation in that experience, a revelation in there's some reality, some other type of enlightenment that can be had, not so much just through ascending, but by going deeper into the world, into matter. And he eventually did them. Obviously, I'm shortening this story quite a bit, but eventually he had a revelation, a moment of where the world sort of turned inside out, and he realized that this thing that you can discover through ascending is also the essence of the reality of what you that you come to if you descend into matter and incarnatedness and the earth and so on itself. So Aurobindo then conceived of a state of mind that he called supermind, a state of consciousness that expressed this union of these two realities, a bridge between spirit and matter, between heaven and earth. And that enlightenment for him was better understood as the union of these realities and the experience of incarnating and discovering the one within the other, as opposed to, like say in Advaita Vedanta, for instance, there's a sort of heavy emphasis on just suggesting that the world's a Maya, that the key of enlightenment is just to see that this is all kind of an illusion and to not be caught up in that. And in a sense, there's a truth in that, but also I believe there's a truth in what Aurobindo was saying as well. Now, what Aurobindo began to realize towards the end of his life is that it's not that this realization was new. Other masters had realized this before, some more profoundly than he had, in fact. For instance, he discovered a master named Ramalinga, who lived in the 19th century, who in some basic sense was involved in a similar process, and his realization was so profound that so complete was his embrace tantrically of the body, of the so-called matter that our bodies are made up of, that in the last couple of years of his life, first he became luminous. People said that they could see a radiance around him. Then his body became so purified that it became insubstantial, so that you could see him very clearly like an ordinary human being, but there was no substance. You could put your hand through him. And he lived for like a year in this state. And then finally he said to his disciples that his incarnation was complete, and he went into a hut and took in Dzogchen they call the rainbow body. They saw the violet luminosity coming out through the cracks in the windows and the doors. Ramalinga was gone. So this took about 2 years for his body to go through this transformation that resulted from such a profound embrace of matter. So in one sense, the truth of Vedanta is that there is ignorance in the world. Human beings and nature kingdoms, in part, were made up of an energy and of matter, a consciousness that is confused and misunderstands, and we create out of that, we participate and create an experience of density and alienation, and we create karma, and we create disease and suffering and so on. And in that sense, that's real, and in that sense, that is caused by ignorance, as sort of emphasized in teachings like Vedanta and Theravada Buddhism and so on and so forth. At the same time, with the tantric view, the way in which that's different, in a sense, and Aurobindo initially didn't really use the word tantra, but eventually he came around to realizing that tantra was more or less an expression of this same understanding. It was sort of more of an expression of what he called supermind, a different point of view. And tantra sees this continuity. It looks at the body, at desire, at karma, at matter or substance, elements, the world, and says we don't need to move away from this or even just see through it as the only way to understand it. There is a latent consciousness and spirit within all of this, the very nature of it, and that can be awakened and liberated through our state of consciousness and how we relate to it. So this is more of what this new archetype looks like. It's more world engaging. It's more compassionately embracing the world around us. It's more tantrically envisioned, transformative, It opens a much more profound sense to a sense of it really facilitates more healing, for instance. Healing is much more of a tantric idea than it is necessarily an idea of, like, say, seeing through something. There's a facilitation of a restoration and a healing and a reawakening of a truer nature in a reality when we experience a sense of healing and transformation. So Aurobindo saw this. He also felt that he and the mother were participating in a kind of cutting edge process of not necessarily discovering a new archetype, but facilitating that archetype being born into the world in a way that opened the earth and humanity more collectively to having greater access to this point of view. And that I do resonate with very much. For me, though, a little bit different. I have some my own, variations on how I view all of this compared to Aurobindo, but I do feel strongly that they were in the spirit of a stage of participating in the emergence of this consciousness. The timing, I think, is a little different than they understood. I think this is a multi-stage process, and we're still in the midst of that emergence. That sort of, and that for me, again, is part of what I feel is an implication of planetary initiation, as it is this emergence of a new archetype. And Aurobindo and the mother were involved in exploring that as well. Others, in one way or another, refer to that. That's another long story. Even folks like Ken Wilber, with his integral thought, is a version, an aspect of that same emergent archetype. Even Bailey made reference to this at one point. One, for instance, rather interesting and obscure reference that Alice Bailey made in one of her books, I believe it was The Rays and Initiations, is she said that the masters were in the process of gradually shifting their focus from the higher mental plane to the Buddhic or intuitive plane. Now, that in and of itself doesn't sound like, what does that mean exactly? But, well, one way to talk about what that means is that in the way that I've talked about the three views, traditional, tantric, and non-dual, if we were to overlay that distinction on these different planes, there's a strong way in which the higher mind is the traditional perspective, the causal body point of view. Whereas the Buddhic plane is a much more tantric view. It's the fourth plane. It's in the middle. It sees a kind of union of spirit and matter. There's a deeper way in which the causal body view is really the home of our human soul, and from there we descend into incarnation, and then we ascend back to the causal body in a regular cycle that takes place hundreds of times. So kind of built into this wheel of time, this circle of life that is our causal body, is a process of a cycle of, it's a seed point from which we come down into a body and experience life and go through experiences, much of which we don't understand the spiritual significance of until we leave incarnation and review it. And as we complete the cycle and go back to the causal body, our human soul self, we harvest the fruits of that incarnation, which then leads to the next cycle. So it's around and around. And although that's a very profound archetype, there's still very much a descending, ascending, out breath, in breath, cyclic reality to that. Causal body, in a sense, therefore, is more dualistic. It's a spiritual kind of dualism, you might say, but still, it's kind of going back and forth between these realities. The Buddhic consciousness is a much deeper kind of in the moment realization of the marriage of these two realities, of even universal mind beyond the causal human mind. It's a marriage of consciousness and form, of Shiva and Shakti, of Logoic and holy spiritual, of the feminine and the masculine. It's a very deep vision of marriage and interrelatedness. And from that vision, that's one of the reasons why after gaining the wisdom that results from many lives, we're born into this larger reality where we can, in the moment, in the eternal now, see this eternal marriage of opposites. And that, in a sense, the causal body sees that transformation as a coming death. In a sense, that's kind of ironic because that's the causal body's point of view. It looks in terms of deaths and rebirths, of non-continuity, of cycles and back and forth. Actually, from the point of view of the intuitive or Buddhic or Tantric or interrelatedness point of view, the causal body is transformed into that new vision. It is integrated and liberated into a point of view in which a larger vision of the always present interconnectedness and interdependence of all of these realities is revealed. So this is one of the ways that Aurobindo is not quite understanding that point of view. He was still kind of in a certain stage of, because he kept having the idea that this energy needed to be brought down from a higher plane and kind of injected into matter. We needed to sort of infuse the world with supermind. Actually, it's my understanding that the more deeply we understand this new archetype, this new point of view, it's really about, one way to understand it, it's really about understanding the way things already are in this dimension. It's a new perspective about form and matter and the feminine and nature and our bodies and desires and so on. It's not an infusing, like sort of beaming light from some other place. But there's a way in which that's a perfectly legitimate kind of spiritual practice, to share light, to transmit light from one source to another and so on. But from a more profoundly and purely intuitive point of view, it's actually the transmission of a new perspective. It's entering into an understanding where you see the divinity inside of something, and your recognition of it is the deeper part of what facilitates the heart of the transformation, because your direct realization of the soul latent within form, for instance, is what is at the foundation of its emergence, its recognition, and so the transformation isn't some mechanical process where you add an ingredient in the sense of like injecting energy. It's more of a communion of your very soul and consciousness with that reality that brings it out, that nurtures it, that touches it and recognizes it and participates in its awakening thereby. So part of facilitating planetary awakening for me, for Karen and I, is also a more profound participation in a deepening understanding of a way of being in relationship to the world, and a transformation of, therefore, our experience of the world and our experience of ourselves. In fact, our very experience of the nature of the Dharma itself. And so there's a way in which, by being with the world situation and deeply honoring what's happening and feeling it, opening to that, the experience of within oneself. And we start with our own human nature, our own personalities, and we discover a deepening way to relate to our own experience as human beings. And as that unfolds and our heart keeps awakening more deeply, we find ourselves in a stronger relationship to the world around us and ultimately to the earth. And in that relationship, two things are happening. One is that we're in a sense being educated by the world. We are being drawn into a discovery of what is the true nature of that we're in relationship to. What's beyond our surface understanding of what's beyond even the understanding of that which we're in relationship to, another person, humanity as a whole, the earth as a whole. What's below the surface, not only of our own perception of those realities, but even of the way those realities experience themselves. And it's in that relationship of communion and connection and discovery that we participate in this transformation and healing and awakening. So for me, for Karen and I, in fact, our experience of opening to what Aurobindo called supermind, when in some ways I prefer to sort of take out of traditional context, even beyond, say, linking it to a particular consciousness, let's say like the Buddhic plane, to be freest in my experience of the process of discovery. At the deepest levels, I open to just a raw, intuitive experience of what is this? What is happening? What is this reality that we're participating in? A kind of simple, pure, unconditioned, loving awareness of what is. It's fully present here, not seeking a truth by conceiving of it and then striving for that somewhere else, like, oh, I have to discover my Atman on some plane or something like that. Just being with this reality here is the participation, is the process. And for me as a participant in planetary growth and healing and awakening, there's a deep tantric quality that I've discovered that if I just sit with that reality, there's a kind of indescribable process of sharing in the suffering of the world, sharing in its healing and evolution, where the raw material of all of that is what kind of evolves and transforms and gives birth to new spiritual understanding of the nature of things. So for me, there's a powerful theme in that for decades of doing that work, where there's a sense that there is a new archetype emerging, a new vision of the Dharma. And it's being born out of being with the crisis of the world, the Marduk or moon chain or whatever we want to call that karma. And even my understandings of what those things are, what does it mean that there's a planetary initiation? What is the history of the world with regard to this event? Where did that come from? In the sense of like what, I don't really sit with a sense of trying to figure that out. I just participate in the world. I be present as deeply as I can with all of that. In that sense, there's a strong kinship I feel with Aurobindo and the Mother, in that it's very much about a full incarnated participation. And there's definitely an aspect of my experience of like being willing to open to the darkness, pain, the depths of the world, collectively human and planetary. Not that I go seeking that either. I'm not like trying to get on an elevator and go down. I'm just being present and opening to what arises And that's the process of healing and education of, in my experience, in terms of like the changes I'm going through, the deepening of my understanding. In one sense, I feel like just life, the world is my teacher, karma is my teacher, suffering is my teacher, my body, the earth, and just being with all of these things in a very open, and in some ways it takes a bit of courage because it's a difficult journey, especially in these times. But what's a paradox about that is it's also because of how difficult these times are that this initiation is being born. To me, it's inseparable that the earth is in a state of crisis and in a state of revelation at the same time. They're two sides of the same reality. Okay, so I'm going to pause for a moment now, see if there's any questions. Let me turn the microphones back on. And also I see...
Yeah, me again. Sorry, I probably have taken up my space of time in this. But anyway, if we look at the time now, what we're going on with the world now, with all the issues that we have, which is global warming, we have political right turn in many countries. We have shooting in the USA. We have Donald Trump as a president. China's leader is just today taking power for the rest of his life. He cannot stop again. I mean, that's really a lot of power. Russia is crossing every opposition, and etc., etc. So much going on. Is that just a step back, or is it just leading up to the first initiation? And that's only the western side of the world.
Mm-hmm. In a sense, I think ultimately the answers to that we'll only know in the long run. But I do think that it can be viewed as an inevitable part of the process. Something that needs to come up, something that we need to go through as part of the turmoil and challenge of planetary initiation. And that although on one level it feels like, when you're entering into a kind of breakdown of an old order, there's a sort of Shiva function to that where things feel like they're falling apart. It's not uncommon, for instance, like in a classic shamanic initiatory crisis, as it's been, described, for instance, by, anthropologists or others who have, related to those traditions. There's a sense of descent into disease and difficulty that's inherent in the moment of initiation, or the process of initiation. And so for me, that's one of the ways that I differ from, say, Aurobindo, as Aurobindo and the mother felt like it was very imminent that this initiation, if you will, was going to take place. And my feeling that was because they were participating in one of the sub-stages of the process, and that process was coming to a turning point. But there was actually, in my mind, more descent that needed to happen, more a breaking down, more healing to take place, more opening to planetary karma and difficulties. And we're still in that process, and I think we're going to continue to see that for some time before we open to that opportunity for awakening and reversal, that where a shift happens in collective consciousness, especially in a certain portion of the population. So yes, that generally, aside from the question of whether or not all of that will work out as hoped, yes, I feel like it's part of the inevitable process of opening to planetary karma and the the challenges that come with that. There's a way in which it can kind of feel like one is losing ground when that's happening. In sort of more almost psychological terms, one way to understand that is that if one has, let's say, a certain amount of karma in our subconscious, and then we enter into a process where we're growing and we're opening, some of the basic qualities that go with spiritual expansion of consciousness and being are from a Shakti point of view, are Kundalini awakenings, and that's an energizing function. Like it moves up through the chakras, it opens chakras. From a consciousness point of view, which is just the flip side of that same reality, things are changing in our awareness. Our awareness is becoming more equanimous, more accepting. In fact, just generally more aware. And both of those realities, which are just the energetic and consciousness facets of the same process of expansion and change, cause things like, to look at it from a bodily point of view, cause the chakras to open. And in opening, ultimately that leads to a discovery of the spiritual reality latent in each chakra, in each dimension of our nature. But it can't be discovered without a purging and a healing, a transformation of the karma that's also in our bodies and our subconscious, and comes out into our conscious experience and into our bodies more overtly as our chakras open. So for instance, if one just sits down to meditate and sits in a very relaxed way and becomes very mindful and present and loving and equanimous as best one can, that usually doesn't necessarily immediately just lead to feeling blissful and free. And it leads to a process of purification and cleansing where energies start to more quickly arise from our subconscious and move through our experience, move through our bodies and our minds. So there's both a process of increased positivity. We're growing in presence, we're growing in contentment and peace and concentration and other qualities like this. At the same time, the very growth of those qualities is causing karma to come up more rapidly, to be healed and transformed. So if we apply that to the planetary level, I think we're in the stage now where the expansion of consciousness that's going on in the world is causing karma to come up more fiercely, and that there's times where from an outer point of view, that can feel like we're losing ground. There's more difficulty. The karma is more intense. That's a natural part of, especially for the first initiation, and to a large extent the second initiation. That's a key part of the process. That's a way that it will be experienced. It's actually part of all the initiations. In a mysterious way, it's even part of higher initiations, post-liberation initiations. The reincarnating initiate will open to new levels of planetary karma, and relating to and transforming that into their own experience, manifest higher levels of initiation. So there's always, in my experience, a way in which there's continued opening to. But what's different for, say, a first-degree initiate is first-degree initiates are generally not so advanced not to be fairly stressed out by that process, and to not yet have enough inner presence and equanimity and understanding to contain it more. Say a third-degree initiate might go through that same process in that cycle, but they have much more presence, much more wisdom, much more heart. And so they're not thrown off by that, as they might be more so, especially at the first, somewhat at the second. So that's the general Any follow up to that question or enough? Yeah. Okay. Well, it's getting on. Why don't we take our break now, and we'll come back in about 10 minutes and continue. Okay. let's have a meditation now. Take a moment to become more fully present. Feel your body more fully. As you breathe, feel yourself relaxing and feel your mind becoming more calm. And feel a deepening sense of just being present, being at peace. Feel a deepening sense of acceptance. Just accepting your experience of your human nature, your body and thoughts and feelings. Just being with whatever's there and accepting. And also being with your life, with the world, and accepting the world around you as well. Feel a basic sense of freedom in just being present and accepting. Also feel a sense of awareness of the sort of foundation of your experience in this moment, your physical body, its contact with the surface that your body is resting on. Sensation of firmness and greater density. Let your awareness dwell in that density. Being present, noticing. A sense of warmth in your awareness of your body and the earth, the earthiness of your experience. And open to a sense of that there is vibration within that, even though it's dense, hard, solid. Even there's life force, vibration, movement. Letting your awareness dwell in your feelings, particularly the densest aspect of your feelings, your body. You may even feel a heaviness of maybe tiredness or emotions. Just being with all of that. Letting all that into your heart. As you sit with all of those feelings, whatever is there naturally in your awareness, seek to sense a spirit within it, the Christ presence within matter, within form, the Shakti, enlightened life force. You might feel this as vibration. Hear it as subtle sounds. See it as luminosities. Sometimes the sensation of heaviness, of emotion or physical density, strong enough that we don't quite sense this presence within it. If that's the case, just let that be. Just be present. Just be aware. being at peace with how that is. Now let your awareness expand again. Become more spacious, not excluding your body or the earth, solidity, but including it in a more spacious, heartful presence. In that openness, in that spaciousness, sense your interconnectedness with all of life. And feel the way in which just being deeply present, at peace, in loving awareness in itself brings you into the middle of supporting our world's healing and awakening. Bring your awareness back to your breath. Feel yourself again more connected to your body. And when ready, open your eyes. Perhaps at this point I'll create some space to see if there's any more questions. Yes. Linda?
Yes.
You have a question?
Yes. Am I unmuted or what?
Yes, I can hear you.
In this talk about the new Dharma or the merge of a new spirituality, I really resonate with this. I really resonate with it, and I can almost feel that it's a part of my nature or inner self, and it also raises a lot of questions, and because the awakening of the spirit within the matter or mother or the earth or the different level of the manifestation, the realms. What am I saying? I'm thinking about attachment and not detachment. And I'm thinking about that kind of, what kind of spirit that is within attachment, because we always talk about detachment. And one of my teachers talked about, before she died, about this, the spirit within attachment. And I was thinking about if you had some experiences or anything you could say about that. And when I'm saying that, I also feel the attachment that is through gravity. And I think what I'm asking is that it feels like, for me anyway, that it's more difficult to, or maybe it's just because it's new in my own history and my own development, to be detached and attached. It's like, it's not just attachment. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
It brings out a lot of, interrelated, a lot of questions about being interrelated, being attached, and being, in the world within relation to this and that, and and it's very exciting, and I like it, but it brings out a lot of questions that, in my thinking, it's more difficult than just being detached. But what am I to say? I don't know.
Yeah.
Just what I'm thinking or sensing.
Yeah, in some ways, it's true. In a sense, that's one of the reasons that I really valued this notion. I don't know if Norbu called it the three views. I may have just started calling it that myself, but Norbu was the inspiration for me in understanding a way of kind of categorizing three main archetypes of spiritual understanding, what I'm calling traditional tantric, and we'll call it mystical or transcendental or non-dual is another way to characterize that. And one of the reasons I think it's powerful to understand that these three views, as opposed to just zooming in on one, is that it's not as if there's just one valid point of view. Each of them shines a light on the situation. And together, the three complement each other and provide a sort of balanced view. And also that, in many ways, the traditional, what I call the traditional view, that wasn't Norbu's word, he used the term the path of renunciation. So for him, it was the path of renunciation, the path of tantra or transformation, and the non-dual view. And part of the difference, part of the importance of the three is that they're somewhat also developmental too, that you need a foundation on the traditional view. So part of what the traditional view teaches is to detach oneself, say, from the ego, from delusion, from ignorance, from desires, from aversions, from all of that. And then what the tantric view teaches is that there's a way of experiencing that there's an inner spirit inside of each of these things that we're detaching from, that can be viewed in a new way, where we're transforming and awakening that inner spirit and bringing it out, you might say. So if we put the two together, one way to look at that, let's say if we're for instance, in parenting, we love our children, but we're also attached to our children. And so we don't necessarily, we can look at it from one point of view as I need to just be detached from my children. But that's not a complete picture of parenting, because we also need to love our children. So how do we become detached from them and love them at the same time? Is that suggests there's some kind of a difference, like I'm letting go of one thing, but I'm still affirming something else. What we're letting go of is having too much of a personal agenda about how we love. Are we projecting our own needs onto them? Are we trying to mold them into something to fit our own desires? Or are we not letting them individualize? Are we wanting to be overly involved in their life? Or there's all kinds of ways that our personal desires and fears and issues can get tangled up in our love. So when we talk about detaching, we're not saying don't love. We're saying letting go of that personal dimension, our own limited forms of experiencing love, in order to foster a stronger presence of spiritual love. And so one way of looking at that, though, is that, yes, in one sense, we can talk about it as a part of that process as detachment. But also, in the end, it wasn't as if it was necessarily black and white, where there were moments when we're attached and moments when we were purely loving. It's more like they're mixed together. Like the form our love took was imperfect. We're all, imperfect human beings. So, of course, in any relationship, certainly in parenting, there's going to be imperfection in our love. From the tantric view, we're not renouncing love. We're transforming it. We're still engaged in our experience of being in relationship with our kids, and we're loving them in spite of our imperfections. But we're also growing spiritually, and so that the ways in which we're attached and have desires in relationship to those attachments and desires are transforming. They're becoming more spiritualized, so to speak. Like one way to look at it is, we can talk about enlightenment as, let's say, realizing our interrelatedness with all beings, with all of life. If we awaken that realization in the midst of our attachments, then those attachments get transformed into spiritual love instead of personal love. In a sense, attachment is just a person-centered, I'm a separate being, desire-based, way of relating. Attachment and desires. It's that very same energy, though, that turns into love. If all we do is detach, we end up being very cool, indifferent beings that without heart, without love. We have to include and transform our human aspect of concern and love and connection and attachment and desire, and refine it, transform it, liberate it into spiritual love. So in that context, it becomes a little more subtle a process, because then terms like detachment don't mean just rejecting love. It means seeing the heart of it, seeing the inner spiritual beauty there, and just kind of transforming and liberating that from its constraints by our personalness, our so detachment really is one aspect of describing the process, but it's not a complete description because it alone, it just sounds like we're letting go of something. We're rejecting it. We're, at least we're just becoming equanimous towards it. That's not really a complete description. Therefore, that's why Tantra is a more advanced understanding, is because it takes more intuition to really understand it and to live it.
Yeah.
And it's based on a foundation of the more traditional point of view, which isn't, the reason I changed the word from Norbu, use of the word renunciation, is because it was kind of making reference to the idea that a lot of spiritual practitioners relate to desire by renouncing it. And so they follow the path of renunciation, so he called it that. And then Tantra doesn't view the need to renounce, like for instance, in being a householder and having kids, being in a relationship, we're obviously not renunciates, so we have to view working with desire in those contexts as a transformation of those of love, rather than just renouncing it. I use the word traditional because I feel like there's really two sides to the foundational path. It's not just renouncing; it's affirming. So you negate. What is it what is causing the suffering? What's limiting me? What's obscuring my true nature? What do I need to let go of? And what do I need to affirm? How do I build that? And in the traditional view, they're seen as two distinct things, and you let go of one and you build up the other. Yeah. In the tantric view, it's seen that, yes, we need to make that distinction. And yes, there are times when we need to emphasize letting go. And another aspect of the process is affirmation, strengthening. But also, and this is a very important distinction, the essence of this that we're calling, that which we need to let go of, the hindrances, the obstructions, the ego, and so on. The essential nature of that too is something that can be transformed into the positive. And so it's not entirely about renouncing, it's about transformation as well. And when we get clear about the difference, then we have a foundation for understanding how to transform the one into the other. So at that stage, we don't have to reject life. We don't have to reject body and nature and desire and judgments and the mind. We can transform all of that into spiritual expression, spiritual realization.
And then the sort of development that comes along with that is more like how much can I contain? How much can I contain? So it's more like you're not evolving in the same way, maybe you're evolving with getting bigger in containment and in the containment, holding it, getting bigger. I can hold this, and now I can hold this feeling and these feelings, and maybe in the end I can hold the earth and the universe and so on. Something like that. Is that like the essence of this tantric thing you're talking about?
I would say it's certainly
some of it.
a part of it, yes. Each image, kind of brings out a truth.
Yes.
When we say something like containment, that's a powerful spiritual experience and image. Also, other dimensions of it might be, communion with.
Yes.
So containment
yes.
Yeah.
So that's where the attachment comes in.
Mm-hmm.
And I also hear that to really understand detachment, you cannot see it in its own environment. You have to have like a koan. Only maybe if you practice, you have to practice very, just for the practice, but not because it's a truth in itself, right?
Mm-hmm. Detachment is a powerful understanding or tool, you might say, a quality, when we're involved in the experience of being very much caught up in something, attached, embroiled. So the first step is to step back, to detach, to disidentify. But once we have some measure of that going on, then detachment alone isn't the best description of how our enlightenment deepens, because then we need to start to move into, well, how do I maintain an enlightened relationship to what I just detached from? And detachment alone is not a good description of that, because we need to love it. We need to see the divinity in it even. And that is not as well described by detachment. The detachment has a role, very profound quality, but alone it's not, it more emphasizes the traditional stage. It's one of the components of the traditional stage. And then Tantra and non-dualism. Tantra sees the capacity to heal and transform and bring out the divinity. And essentially what non-dualism means is it's being in that view where in each moment you see the Buddha nature of everything that's arising, whether you call it God or the Tao or Brahman or the true self or whatever. There's nothing but that. And so there's no need to transform or detach or to heal or to... The state of consciousness is you're seeing the self-perfected nature of each moment of experience arising, whatever it is. And that is the healing, that is the awakening. And there's no conception in that of needing to heal or fix or detach from or liberate or anything. Now that doesn't mean, though, like if you were to interact, such a being in that state is interacting with the world, they don't necessarily always talk in those terms because they're relating to people in different states of consciousness. So the traditional and tantric levels can be fully functional in the same person and relate in those ways. So you can have a Dzogchen master who's also engaged in a practice that's traditional based or tantrically based, because that's what's sort of appropriate at that level.
Yeah.
But in that state, it's all held in this deeper view. So that I'm just throwing that in to kind of round out the discussion a little bit about these three views.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because to really commune, when I feel commune, it becomes, in my kind of experience, a sort of essence also in Tantra. It's like this, the lineage that I have touched through Asker and the Golden Circle has been this really deep communion, and it, when I combine it with my lineage of Shakti, it's like it merges, and I can lean into this and I can lean into that, you know. So, well,
exactly. And this is where it gets very important to make the shift to a more tantric and non-dual view, because the mainstream religions of the world have for thousands of years emphasized for humanity as a whole the traditional point of view, and making a basic distinction between that which we need to let go of and that's what we need to cultivate, the negative and the positive. And in simple words are used like good and evil or wholesome and unwholesome. And some of these are also more refined than others. Some can be very heavy-handed, where the letting go is condemning and judging and repressing, and then the positive is, can be equally fanatical. So it's not that the traditional view is intrinsically a problem. It's that, first of all, if it exists in a way that's very heavy-handed like that, then it can be doing just as much harm as good, or even more harm than good. But even when it's refined, it's not a complete view by itself, because the main style of relating to that which we're letting go of is to see it as a cause of limitation, a cause of suffering, and to distance ourselves from it. And even if we're not very judgmental and condemning in doing that. We're still basically detaching from it and letting it go. But it's interesting to note that what generally falls into that category of what we're letting go of is the body, nature, desires, even anger, even life itself. Like the classic renunciate in the hardcore form is somebody who steps back. They don't engage in relationships. They don't procreate. So they don't have kids. They don't have a house or a job, or, you know, they basically just step back from most of what other humans are doing, in a sense that the message in that is all of that is not divine. Whereas the tantric view can inhabit that and say, I can transform this. It's not what you do, it's the spirit in which you do it. And so I can inhabit my human nature, I can engage in relationships, and if I transform my desires, if I transform even, you know, my whole lifestyle, then I can infuse a new vision into, and a new spirit into all of that. And part of what gets released when we do that is that then we look inside of matter, of the body, of the elements, of desires, and we begin to see the latent Christ spirit that's hidden within that, and it awakens. And so for me, when we make a distinction between, say, Shiva and Shakti, or the divine masculine and feminine, it's a way of talking about that because a basic element of human experience is the dimension of experiencing mind versus body, then if we ultimately, what we find a lot of deeper spiritual traditions teach is that both mind and body obscure, if we're identified with them, they obscure our true nature. They obscure realizing our interconnectedness with all life. There's some way in which the experience of the dualism of mind and body and that whole state of consciousness leads to a sense of separation and of suffering and so on. So if we, one way of talking about it tantrically is, well, we can go into the essence of mind or body and discover our true nature there. One way is I'll detach myself from them and discover my true nature that way. I turn my attention away from mind and body and realize spirit. Another way is to look deeply enough at mind and body. And so for me, one of the ways of understanding what these archetypal realities of the divine male and divine female, or Shiva and Shakti, Logos and Holy Spirit are, is that if you go deep into mind, you find Shiva there. And if you go deep into the body, you find Shakti there. But if you're engaged in a spiritual path that pushes both of those away, or, as some do, kind of confuse universal mind with spirit, as if that's better, and then you look at the body as the problem and distance yourself from that, there's no opportunity there to honor the spirit that's within the body, that particular facet of awakened enlightenment. And that's essentially rejecting the feminine. So a key element of what is important about the tantric view is that it honors the form of enlightenment that is the divine feminine and the divine masculine. Some lean the other way. Some kind of, like I live on the west coast of the United States, and a big part of that is California, and a big movement that started in California even as far back as the 50s. It's in other parts of the world too, of course, but was kind of mind is a problem and the body is the truth. And you need to trust your feelings. Don't think about stuff. Just go with the flow. Follow your feelings. That's enlightenment. That's essentially the opposite point of view. That's saying that the mind is bad and the body is wisdom. The body is goodness. The body is divine. And that's just the flip side of the same confusion, in my opinion. There's a deeper reality inside of both of these. And when we contact that, we're also open to the realization that those two are radically interdependent. At a level of reality in which we contact Shakti or Shiva through the pathways of mind or body, we discover that there's no separation between them either. The Shiva can't exist without Shakti, and vice versa. They're a radically interdependent reality. And so another way to talk about enlightenment is to see the interrelatedness of all things, and a basic archetypal level of that is the radical independence of mind and body. And all of that parallels that Shiva and Shakti, spirit and matter, if you will. It's a little trickier one because it's using spirit in a particular way, etc. You know, there's a lot of terms that kind of overlay on that, Logos and Holy Spirit and so on and so forth. So yes, okay, so thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're down for time. Take another question or two if there are any. I'm looking at the chat box too to see if there's any questions I've missed there. Looks more like comments. Thank you for sharing. No more questions? Well, since I'm on this theme of Shiva and Shakti, I'll speak to that for a few more minutes before concluding today. When we talk about something like an initiation, in this case, the first planetary initiation, of course, we can talk about that from different points of view. Talking about it from a more tantric point of view, one way to understand what the first initiation is it's a first stage of awakening in our soul to the realization of the inner relationship between Shiva and Shakti. In other words, the divine marriage of masculine and feminine is awakened in our being in a new way. And we have the intuitive recognition that this is reality. Now, let's say if you're a renunciate and you're following a traditional renunciate path and you're a first degree initiate on the physical plane and in your physical body, that won't necessarily be the fundamental intuition that you're experiencing. You may be emphasizing other qualities like awareness or devotion or equanimity as some of the key qualities, for instance, that you're cultivating that are leading to this realization. So it really depends on the kind of, but in your soul, deep down inside, your soul is having a deep realization of this interrelatedness of things. Whether or not it comes out that way in your personality yet. It's gonna come out somehow in your personality, but it might come through the lens of whatever path you're on. As we shift to a new archetype, though, on a global scale, the way that insight, I think, will incarnate into the world in millions of people is as this growing awareness of a more interrelatedness realization, a marriage, an interdependent consciousness, a marriage of the divine masculine and feminine, a tantric vision. And that can take many forms and people will understand it in different ways, but it'll, in my view, it'll have much less of a flavor of the renunciate quality. And that's very important because that's key to the healing of the earth, to not only the resurrection of the feminine, but a consciousness deepening in humanity that restores our relationship to nature, to our own human nature, or a type of spirituality that's more integrated with our humanness, our bodies, our emotions, and also with the non-physical aspects of nature as well. So a key aspect of what's happening at the first initiation is that from a more energetic point of view in the body, a transformation and evolution is happening where the flow from an energetic point of view of male and female energies. You know how most people are probably familiar with the basic image of not only the chakras, but also the three channels that run along the spine and into the head. And there is a solar and a lunar channel and a central channel. So from an energetic point of view, the first foundational awakening to a way in which the lunar and solar energies relate, are marrying in our energy system, takes place, and they merge into the central channel and the Kundalini awakens. And many times people think, well, that's some kind of dramatic thing where you experience a big flow of energy or an explosive, release of a fiery energy, or et cetera, et cetera. Generally, experiences like that certainly happen, but this is more of an ongoing process. It's something that takes place over years and decades and even longer. But upon reaching the first initiation, a shift happens where that energetic change, looked at from the body and Shakti point of view, is taking place, and the Kundalini awakens out of this union. Kundalini is born out of the union of Shiva and Shakti on an energetic level. Now, when the planetary disaster happened, that relationship was further veiled. It was further, in a sense, put to sleep. It was further obstructed. And so in order for that union to take place on a planetary level, and for planetary Kundalini to awaken, it means that the Marduk disaster that karma has to go through a deep healing, and not necessarily be completely resolved, of course, but has to transition to a point where we've worked through enough of it that heaviness, that veiling that's obstructing global awakening is adequately healed so that union can take place, the union of these two. And there's many levels of implications and meaning to that. Like, there's many ways that we can see within human civilization, for instance, or the forms that spirituality take, or the level of consciousness that exists in the world, or even the way humans relate to nature, for instance. Like in the last century, it's not coincidental that we've seen a much greater interest in, even starting with some of the earliest transmissions like Theosophy. There was a much stronger tantric spirit in Theosophy and subsequent outgrowth teachings of the many things that came out of that. Some of the things that kind of were inspired by that came later, like Findorn was very strong in contacting nature spirits. This is part of the healing of the masculine and feminine in the earth. Planetary Kundalini awakening is through this marriage means a stronger opening in the human kingdom to an awareness of what could be called, in a sense, the Shakti lineages, and on a planetary level, not within the human kingdom per se, but on a planetary level, that includes the intelligences that work with nature, for instance, Archangel. That's why we see this woman, Lorna Byrne, talking so much about it. Angelology is a very common theme. So many books and authors and teachers talking about this now. Daskalos put a very heavy emphasis on working with the archangels of the elements and other archangelic orders, and he had a profound connection to these nature intelligences and holy spiritual intelligences. So we're seeing this in a wide variety of ways coming out, even the sort of the general, what people sometimes have called the New Age movement is filled with that kind of spirit. It's not always in the most enlightened forms. There's a whole spectrum of quality in that sort of dimension of emergent, New Agey spirituality, but nonetheless, it's there because it is part of the emergent spirit of the times. For those who reread or read or subsequently reread the chapter 15 where I talked about my experience of seeing Marduk healing, it's therefore not coincidental that part of what I saw in the third phase of the healing taking place with this tremendous emergence of planetary Shakti. In a sense, even though there was no words in my consciousness, I was in a very super conscious state of one with the planet, where ordinary human mind and emotions and so on were not present in the normal sense. So there wasn't language in the experience, but the pure intuition was of this spiritual, tremendous, divine vitality awakening in the earth. So there's a deep connection between the first initiation, the healing of the Marduk disaster, and this global awakening, which includes a global awakening of Kundalini, which has many manifestations, many implications, including a restoration of our contact with other forms of life within our planet in relationship to humanity, nature intelligences, archangels, and so on, especially holy spiritual versions of those, but also even in a broader context as well. Let's see. Thank you. Well, on that note, unless there's any other questions to end with, well, I'll pause there. Are there any question? Any final question? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. Of course, we're getting towards the end. Next week will be our final meeting for this round. What I plan to do then is, you're welcome, is I plan to talk some more concretely next week about the specific kind of more concrete details. We touched into that a little bit today with Britta's question about what's happening in the world, and I want to spend some more time going into. We've laid, I think, a pretty strong foundation in the deeper spirit of what's happening, and looking at some of the details and what some of the possible sort of timelines might look like. Of course, that's a very rich dimension of discussing the world situation and where we're at now, what we've been going through, and what that can look like in the decades and centuries ahead. But also beginning to think about what will come after, the next project. A couple of times I mentioned some themes 2 or 3 times, and there was some strong interest. Let's see, how much time do we have now? I don't want to take too much time, but just to throw out a thought or two. Yes, I will definitely discuss ways we can help in the healing process. One of the themes I touched upon that there seemed to be interest in was going more deeply into the non-dual or transcendent perspective. By that I don't mean transcendent as away from, like distant from the world, but the sort of transcendent from ordinary separative consciousness. Does that sound like something, kind of go much more deep into both a philosophical, but especially a kind of spirit of tapping into a core mysticism. I see some head shaking and up and down, that is, and thumbs up, and okay. Big yes there. Okay. How do people feel about a need for a break? Last time we skipped a week. Does that seem good? Should we take more time off between? Any opinions about that? With the head shaking there, not more time off. Any other opinions? Break is okay. One of the questions, oh yes. That was another theme we touched into and people showed interest in, is maybe some extensive treatment about the lineage, the sort of general topic about the Shambhala or planetary lineage, its subdivisions, its new developments, even just the general work of the masters and other related beings, hierarchies of intelligences. How much interest is there in that kind of a deeper exploration? Seeing a number of thumbs up and okay. Okay, well, I will reflect on this feedback and any inner inspiration that's available, and we'll see what comes about. But it sounds like we'll just continue on with a short break into a next cycle and take on one of these themes next. And there's a vote for no break. Okay, well, we'll figure this out, but I will thank you all for coming today, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.